One thing that most people don't consider as important in privacy is something called metadata. I will tell you right now that this is so important that most of my efforts at educating you all on privacy are focused on how to minimize this metadata. Unfortunately, since the advent of the internet and mobile phones, this has exploded as a major threat. And the extent of the problem is being hidden by big tech, government, and others because they benefit from exploiting this metadata. But what is metadata? Data is the direct action you take to send or receive information. For example, if you send a text message, the content of the text message is the actual data. The time the message was sent, the length of the message, the sender phone number, receiver phone number, IMEI, IMSI, and carrier are metadata. The metadata is the indirect data. Sometimes this indirect data is more revealing than the actual data. In reality, this indirect data can be actual data to another party. You will be shocked at the extent of this collected data. It is in massive databases owned by government, big tech, data aggregators, government contractors, and mercenary data organizations. There is no escape from this if you have not taken precautions. But at the end of the video, I will tell you how to minimize your metadata. My personal metadata footprint is much smaller than the average person because I've been aware of this since the beginning of the internet. Do you want to be aware of your metadata and how to manage it? Stay right there. You emit metadata everywhere, and the average normie or NPC or sheep is completely unaware of this and certainly doesn't appreciate how dangerous it is. 10 years ago, Edward Snowden revealed to us that our own US government was and is conducting mass surveillance of citizens. And the mass surveillance was focused primarily on metadata. So collecting this has become a paragon of advanced technology, and clearly much of this emission of metadata is intentional. This data is truly essential for control. I'm going to just illustrate the problem in some general categories of where the metadata can be found. I'm going to group these in categories so I can emphasize the risks. And these are the categories we're going to discuss. Later on, I will discuss how to minimize these risks. Internet infrastructure. Now, some of you are more advanced and some are beginners in this privacy battle. But I will start simple, and it can get pretty heavy very quickly. The way the internet is constructed is pretty much a boon for surveillance. Every internet action is accompanied by an IP address. For the most part, the average person does nothing to obfuscate the IP address. So this is why everyone collects this bit of information. The IP address identifies the originating network. Typically, this will be your DSL modem at your house. This is where you are most vulnerable because it's a fixed position, and typically the IP address doesn't change. My DSL modem IP address hasn't changed in 20 years. That makes it ultra dangerous because it becomes a fixed identity. The part that you have to understand is that every website or anything you connect to on the internet can see that IP address. Worse yet, most people don't realize this, but every email sent has that IP address on the email header. And to expand the problem, parties in the middle of the network, like a carrier or internet backbone or three-letter agency, can sniff the network and then catch this traffic of IP addresses both coming and going. And this can be accompanied by email data. Even if it's just a sender and recipient data with IP addresses, a three-letter agency can draw a map of who's talking to whom. This is without even reading the actual email, which of course can also be done by anyone sniffing the network. Email traverses the internet in plain text. The other element of internet metadata is called DNS, or Domain Name Services. If you look up www.microsoft.com, a DNS server has to translate that to an IP address. Well, that same DNS server can then store that information and record that your IP address has searched for a particular website. Someone records that. Three-letter agencies obviously know who visits certain websites. This can actually be captured in the open internet anyway. For example, it is certainly recorded when users flock to sites like torproject.org to download a Tor browser. This is often used to access the dark web, and so that kind of metadata will target that person. Finally, there's a technique now where the unique characteristics of your device and your browser are used to do something called browser fingerprinting. This allows even ad companies to track you, at least temporarily, with great accuracy without even using cookies or an IP address. The point is, without any specific action to hide internet metadata, you have to assume that someone is recording your actions on the internet. Mobile phones. Mobile phones have become a boon to those interested in metadata. Phones are unique compared to computers because they have sensors that generate additional data. For example, it has a GPS and gyro and Wi-Fi, all of which can determine a location in space. The disturbing detail about phone location data, which I discuss in many videos, is that you cannot turn off this location tracking. You cannot hide your location from Apple, Google, or your carrier. Location tracking is the #1 threat on the phone. But another threat that is equally dangerous is that the phone has a unique identity, even more precise than an IP address. For example, the phone has a unique IMEI number. This number is then matched to the user of the phone and can validate your identity on Google, for example, without even using a phone number. In addition to just the individual pieces of data on the phone, which include the IP address, IMEI, IMSI, location, Google ID, and Apple ID, is that this data is considered as a set. Meaning if I know the Google ID, I can find the location. If I know the IP address, I can find the IMEI. In other words, each data item is an index to each other. This is why the phone is so dangerous. It actually ensures that your identity is known anytime you go on the internet. Known to specific players like Google, Apple, and to three-letter agencies they share this data with. Third parties collect this information too. Your IP address is matched to location and sold to data aggregators, which I will talk about later. Because of the identity issue, the mobile phone is the worst privacy threat on metadata ever. This is because the mobile phone is like an ID card. You can never show up on the internet without this ID card. This threat exists with any normie phone. One side of mobile phones that we do not even consider is the fact that it records you. When you're using Siri, do you actually think you're talking to the phone? Of course not. The phone is just a transmitter. You're talking to the Apple and Siri server, and that server then stores your voice for some unlimited period, and then it is passed to the voice recognition processor. The problem is that your voice is stored, and using this voice data and others available on Echo and even on normal phone calls, three-letter agencies have used a voice print technology. This allows them to know it is you just by finding the signature of the sound of your voice anywhere in the environment. And obviously, Apple, Google, and Amazon know what you're thinking based on what questions you're asking in the voice search. Your friends and family. Now, this may be surprising. How can innocent people in your family and friends hurt you with metadata? Well, unfortunately, normies do not understand tech and will do as they're told. Typical NPC behavior. I'll give you a few examples. The most egregious of all offenses is when a naive NPC uploads their contact list to social media. Let's say Facebook. So now this gives Facebook all of your contact names, phone numbers, maybe addresses, birthdays, and emails. Well, Zuck isn't dumb. Zuck will then search for people in his database with the same phone number, email, or name, or similar contacts, and then recommend those people as friends. This creates what people in the intelligence community would refer to as a relationship map. So for example, if a person in your circle is being surveilled by some three-letter agency, they will also start watching people in the circle, and your privacy is automatically invaded. Big tech uses this same contact data to basically identify people. Their main goal is to know who the actual person is with the Google ID, and then that Google ID is used to track you all throughout the internet. This now accompanies most actions on the internet in addition to the IP address because you're logged in on the phone with that Google ID. Another NPC behavior is for your friends to take your photos in family events and then post it on Facebook or Instagram. Well, that photo also has location metadata. And the ancillary data in the photo is a facially recognized individual. So now Facebook and Instagram knows who you are, your location, and who you hang out with. Another typical threat. Your family member connects to your Wi-Fi, then goes to all the social media without regard for location tracking. Location data is then associated with the IP address of your router, and then your router now is part of the reverse IP lookup location database that's sold. The point here is that these sample threats aren't caused by you, but you will be victimized by the NPCs around you. Telecommunications. Telecommunications or phone traffic is another major category used to track us via metadata. Every phone call made on the public switch telephone network, or PSTN, has its details recorded. There's a timestamp, a length of call, and then the phone numbers of the parties are recorded as well. This in itself has been part of the surveillance infrastructure of the world since they invented the telegraph. Phone numbers are tied to KYC, or Know Your Customer data, with your real name, address, social security number, credit report, and so on. The phone number itself is identified on the air by an IMSI. And an IMSI catcher device, like the well-known Stingray, can be used to spot your phone in any given area. This was used, for example, in the January 6th Capitol riot. But aside from using devices to geofence you by your carrier signal, in the US, the CALEA law, Communications Assistant for Law Enforcement Act, allows law enforcement to listen in to your voice traffic directly, look at your call history, and read your texts. In fact, this data used to be supplied to three-letter agencies indirectly, and now this data is pushed to government agencies automatically. For example, it is kept in the FBI DCIS database. Supposedly by law, no one is allowed to record your calls, at least without a warrant, but the ability to listen in is much simplified now. No actual physical wiretapping is needed, just access by an operative over the internet. This is the most difficult of all metadata to bypass. Since all people need to make calls, this can be a way most of us can get sucked, and this includes me. Here's some metadata no one thinks about. We know that you generate metadata with your carrier that the phone is on and has your identity. But did you know that you can also be identified when you turn your phone off? For example, are you turning your phone off because you're about to do something nefarious and you don't want the phone to track you? Or you can be accused of something nefarious because you happen to turn off your phone when some event makes it suspicious. Radio waves. Most wireless devices, particularly phones, announce an identifier over the air. This is outside of cell data. And by announcing this identifier, a listening device can then record the identifier and log that you were in the vicinity. This is a proximity threat. The identifier announced on the air is called the Media Access Control, or MAC address. In fact, your phone has several MAC addresses, one for the Wi-Fi chip and another for the Bluetooth chip. This data is a little bit different because it doesn't automatically go to the internet, meaning it is not part of the normal internet infrastructure. But the radio announcement of this MAC address is itself very revealing. Here's an example of how this metadata is used. You enter a building. Let's say it's some federal building. You'll have to assume there's a listening device tracking MAC addresses in the area. If I match that MAC address to videos with a timestamp of people entering the building, I have basically built a database of visitors and their phones. A MAC address will reveal the device model. I can easily build a device that can listen in on approaching phones so I know who's coming before I even see them. This same MAC address transmission was used to develop the contact tracing infrastructure that Apple and Google were promoting during the height of the pandemic. There's a corresponding radio-related metadata, and that is related to RFID. RFIDs are the chips they put in products at the store so they see if you walk out of the store without paying. The problem is that an RFID receiver can actually spot RFIDs in the wild. Some real IDs in some states come with RFID built in. It is also in your US passport or passport card. It was built into some credit cards in the past. For example, let's see if you're even aware of the metadata. Your car tire has unique RFIDs. So in theory, someone could track the RFID as you're entering a parking lot automatically. Perhaps match that to the photo of the license plate or the driver. What is the value of this? Just like the MAC address, these pieces of data can be used to geofence you, meaning it can be used to prove that you were in a particular area and thus it checks proximity. In a building security case, it can be used to indicate that your car entered the property but did not exit. Environmental sensors. There are plenty of sensors around you that capture your data constantly and then have this stored and used for various surveillance purposes. For example, if you drive through the Golden Gate Bridge in San Francisco, there are no longer any toll booth collectors. You will just get a bill in the mail automatically because of the license plate readers on the road. If you're driving on a toll lane in Los Angeles and you do not have an RFID device announcing your ID, then you will get a ticket automatically. If you commit a moving violation at certain intersections in LA, a camera will take your photo and match it to the driver's license database. And you will get a ticket by mail with your captured photo. Now, this is not just about the fact that these surveillance devices exist. This data is used to track people around the city. Facial recognition and license plate tracking have been used by the company Palantir to do pre-crime analysis in contract with the Los Angeles Police Department. Certain individuals were put in surveillance lists, mostly young people, for associating with gang members, as shown by location metadata. The problem with this use is that there is no crime yet, and yet, as reported in the newspapers, individuals were harassed by police with traffic stops because they were on this surveillance list. Social media. For the most part, you will find that big tech doesn't talk about the privacy dangers of social media. You're being trained to think like an NPC, sheep. So you're likely not aware that your social media activity is used to map your connections. I mentioned that earlier with contact lists. But it's also used to record everything you say to determine your opinions or beliefs. This is then used to classify you. Google calls this classification cohorts. In fact, your actual social media is the sort of data that will be sold by data aggregators that I will talk about next. So to make it clearer for you, your every action on the internet is tied to a Google ID. And because of this, every click, every like, every website you go to, every search, every location is all tied to your identity. There's almost no escaping this if you don't take specific steps. This has become a treasure trove for the likes of Google because not only can this be used to push advertising to you, it is also now being used to control political opinions by suppressing or amplifying messages you see on the internet based on your cohort. Google has precise maps that can identify anti-vax people to specific households, for example. Just an example of capability. Data aggregators, sellers. Unfortunately, a new class of companies make money from your data. So your metadata is bought and sold like a commodity. For example, app developers put advertising on their free apps. Then the wholesaler uses that space on the screen of your phones to capture the location data, IP address, and your identifiers. And then this is sold as a set. This is used, for example, in tracking who's where at what time. This data is out in the open market. This is not at Google or Apple. Location data is sold also as an IP reverse lookup database. Enter an IP address, and the location of that IP address will reveal the exact user if the location is fixed, like with a DSL modem at your home. Your interactions on social media are collected by sites like Axiom, Intellius, Spokeo, and so on. Then they sell this information to anyone, particularly prospective employers. The metadata from Facebook, if you recall, was used by Cambridge Analytica to determine the personalities of 50 million Facebook users, and then that data was used to target the population for election purposes. This was in 2016 and was a big scandal. There are companies that exist for the sole purpose of controlling and manipulating the population. Two well-known ones are Palantir, and the other one is a division of Alphabet, which I will not mention since I am on YouTube. These companies thrive on knowing your metadata, which reveal many of your actions, opinions, and ideas. They've been using this data to control political opinion, predict financial behavior, and I already mentioned earlier, to do pre-crime surveillance. Summary on metadata. Metadata is the antithesis of privacy, so we need to find a way to get rid of it. There is no way to get rid of your past metadata because the internet is permanent. But you can certainly start minimizing your metadata footprint and perhaps make the past data stale. Someone made a comment on my video saying, sorry Rob, but what I say secretly is more important than them knowing who I am. In other words, this person is saying that as long as the communication itself is encrypted, the metadata isn't important. The problem is that metadata is sufficient to actually identify people, know their intent, know their political side, and their financial status, among other things. I can probably have a good guess of a lot of this just by knowing your location history. Wars have been started based on assumptions made from just metadata. The intelligence community is driven by metadata analysis. They don't need to know what you actually said in a secret message. Knowing the patterns of communication between you and others will be enough to profile you. How to minimize metadata. Many of the metadata threats can be minimized. The easiest one to deal with is the IP address. You need some tool to hide your IP address. There are many ways of doing this. The easiest way is to use a VPN. There are other ways to obfuscate your IP address. On a computer, you can use Tor or Lokinet, something I will explain in a separate video. Often using only cell data instead of home Wi-Fi will also do a passable job of obfuscating your IP address. This is because mobile IP addresses are shared by many cell phone users. Starlink will do something similar, so that is also a passable option. The next threat that you need to eliminate is the mobile phone threat with its constant location tracking. Unfortunately, there is only one way to accomplish this, and that is by using a de-Googled phone or some Linux phone. I have many videos on phones, and you need to watch those so I don't have to repeat. The next easy solution is called browser isolation. I have many videos on browser isolation, but the main intent is to deliberately use multiple browsers. Use your Google ID only on one browser like Chrome and never log into Google on other browsers. Next, transition away from texting and calling and use a secure messaging application. One I recommend highly is Session Private Messenger. This just makes your communications traffic be stealthier and that metadata will be minimized. A general tip for metadata obfuscation is to not use your full name or even a real name over the internet. The less you use a real name, the less the opportunity there is to connect you to the data. In other words, if the metadata does not connect to a known identity, then the metadata becomes useless. This is just a starting point. If you did everything I said here, this will reduce your metadata as much as 80%. There's more to do, but this will make a big enough dent. Thanks for watching, and watch my prior videos where I delve deeper into these topics. Focus on the beginner videos so you get a sense for the elements I talk about here. Folks, as it happens, I created 3 products that serve the purpose of reducing your metadata footprint. First, we have the Brax 2 phone, which has no Google ID and is thus invisible to Google. They cannot read the identifiers on the phone like the IMEI, and which you yourself can change. We also have Bytes VPN, which is important for hiding your IP address, and in our case, also hides your DNS metadata. Finally, we have the Brax Mail product, which is an email service that removes the metadata from the header. There is never an IP address or anything that will show where the message is coming from. These products are on my app, BraxMe. The link is in the description. See you later.